She was crying, not quietly, loudly in the middle of a genetics conference in Rio de Janeiro, in front of 200 scientists from 14 countries. A Brazilian researcher, 38 years old, who had spent the last 6 years of her life building what she believed was the most complete genetic map of the Brazilian population ever attempted. 6 years. Thousands of DNA samples, hundreds of thousands of data points, and she had just presented her final conclusion on the big screen behind her. The room had gone completely silent, and then someone in the back row stood up and said, loudly, clearly, with no hesitation, "That is impossible. That cannot be real. You made an error somewhere." She turned to face him, and through her tears, she said something that nobody in that room ever forgot. She said, "I checked it 47 times. There is no error. We were all just looking in the wrong direction." What did she find? What was on that screen that broke a room full of professional scientists into open argument, that made careers shake, that forced 3 major universities to quietly reopen studies they had considered closed for decades? We are going to get there. Every single answer is coming. But first, you need to understand something fundamental. You need to understand the land itself. Because Brazil is not simply a country. Brazil is a verdict written over 20,000 years by migrations, collisions, extinctions, and survivals that make every other national story on Earth look simple by comparison. And if you have ever felt like your own history was stolen from you, like someone rewrote the story before you were old enough to read it, then this video is going to feel very personal, very close. Because that is exactly what happened here. Subscribe right now if you want the full truth, not the version from the textbook, the version from the blood. Now let us go somewhere uncomfortable. Let us go to a moment that almost nobody talks about, because it is too painful, too raw, too inconvenient for the clean national story that Brazil likes to tell about itself. The year 1695. Deep in the interior of Brazil, in a place the Portuguese called the Backlands, the Sertão, a community called Palmares is burning. Palmares was not a village. It was a kingdom, a free kingdom, built over nearly 100 years by people who had been enslaved, who had escaped, who had run into the jungle and refused, absolutely refused, to accept the world that European ships had brought to their shores. At its peak, Palmares held somewhere between 11,000 and 30,000 free people. It had agriculture, governance, military defense, trade. It defeated Portuguese military expeditions sent against it not once, not twice, but more than 20 times over the course of a century. 20 times. The most powerful colonial force in South America could not destroy a kingdom of escaped slaves for 100 years. And then they did. With mercenaries, with indigenous trackers, with a level of organized violence that the colonial government had been saving for exactly this moment. The last leader of Palmares, a man named Zumbi, was captured and executed. His head was displayed publicly, as a warning, as a message that said, "This is what happens to those who refuse." But here's the thing about messages like that. Here's the thing that power always forgets. You can destroy a kingdom. You cannot destroy a bloodline. And the DNA of those people, the people who built Palmares, the people who chose death over slavery, is still alive today, still running through veins in Brazil, still waiting to be read. And that is exactly what our researcher was reading on that screen in Rio de Janeiro. But we are not ready for that revelation yet. First, you need to understand the full depth of what was poured into the genetic cauldron of Brazil. Because it was not just indigenous people and Portuguese colonizers and African survivors. It was so much more complicated, so much more layered, that when you see the complete picture, your brain will genuinely struggle to process it. Let us talk about the Portuguese, and let us be honest about who they actually were, genetically, before they ever set foot on a ship. Because this is where your first shock arrives. The Iberian Peninsula, the land that produced Portugal, is arguably the most genetically complex corner of Western Europe. Think of it as a wall, the western edge of the continent, where every migration that ever crossed Europe eventually ran out of land and stopped. The first modern humans who entered Europe from Africa and the Middle East, roughly 45,000 years ago, they came here. Hunters, following megafauna across the tundra, living in caves, painting animals on walls in ways that still make modern artists stop and stare. Then, around 9,000 years ago, a completely different wave arrived. Farmers from Anatolia, from the land we now call Turkey, spreading westward with their seeds and their goats and their entirely different way of organizing human life. They did not simply replace the hunters, they mixed with them. Slowly, generation by generation, a new genetic layer formed. Then, around 5,000 years ago, another wave. People from the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. These were the people who had horses, who had wheels, who had bronze, and they moved across Europe like a wave that nobody could stop, not because they were more violent necessarily, but because they had technologies that rewrote the rules of survival. They arrived in Iberia too. They mixed too. Another layer added to the wall. But the Iberian Peninsula was not done receiving visitors, not even close. Around 3,000 years ago, Phoenician traders arrived on the southern coast. These were Semitic people from the eastern Mediterranean, from the area of modern Lebanon, the greatest maritime traders of the ancient world. They built cities. They stayed. Their DNA entered the Iberian mix. Then the Greeks came, establishing colonies along the eastern coast. Then the Carthaginians, North African in origin, heavily mixed with the populations of the entire Mediterranean world. Then Rome, and with Rome came soldiers and slaves and traders from every corner of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria. Every single one of those people left genetic traces in the peninsula, and it still was not finished. Because in the year 711, something happened that changed the Iberian Peninsula more dramatically than anything since the steppe migrations 3,000 years before. An army crossed the narrow strait from North Africa into Spain. They were called the Moors by the Europeans. But that name hides an enormous complexity, because these were not a single people. They were Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula. They were Berbers from North Africa, indigenous people of Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, whose own DNA goes back to some of the oldest human populations outside of sub-Saharan Africa. They were people from across the Islamic world, from Persia, from Egypt, from West Africa. And they did not simply conquer the peninsula. They built a civilization on it. For nearly 800 years, the south of what is now Portugal and Spain was one of the most scientifically and culturally advanced places in the entire Western world. Universities, observatories, hospitals, poetry, philosophy, mathematics. The word algebra comes from Arabic. The number 0 traveled through this civilization before it reached the rest of Europe. And all of those people, across all of those 800 years, left their DNA in the population of Iberia. So when a Portuguese sailor stepped off a ship onto the coast of Brazil in the year 1500, he was not simply a European. He was a walking library of 20,000 years of human migration. He carried inside him the genetic echo of hunters who painted caves, of Anatolian farmers, of steppe warriors, of Phoenician traders, of Roman soldiers, of Moorish scholars. And he was about to add his impossibly complex genetic signature to a land that already contained its own 20,000-year-old story. Now, hold that image. Hold the image of those two worlds colliding on a beach. Because what happened next was not a meeting. It was not an exchange. It was a collision of such force, such violence, such biological and cultural devastation that the shock waves are still being measured today in genetic laboratories across Brazil. The indigenous population had no immunity to European diseases. We know this. Smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases that Europeans had spent thousands of years developing partial resistance to through repeated exposure, hit the indigenous people of Brazil like fire hits dry grass. Entire communities, entire nations, gone within a generation. Not from war, from a virus that did not even know it was a weapon. And into the space left by that catastrophe, the Portuguese colonial machine made a decision so monstrous in its scale, so casual in its cruelty, that it reshaped the genetic map of an entire continent. They needed labor. The land was rich beyond imagination. The sugarcane grew like it had been waiting for this moment. The gold was there, in the rivers and the mountains, just waiting to be taken. But taking it required bodies, required work, required human beings who could be owned, moved, discarded, replaced. And so they turned to Africa. What followed was the largest forced migration in human history. Larger than any other. Larger than anything that had come before or has come since. Between the early 1500s and the year 1888, when Brazil finally, last among all nations in the Western Hemisphere, abolished slavery, somewhere between 4 million and 5 million African people were taken from their homes and transported across the Atlantic to Brazil. 4 to 5 million human beings. Each one of them a universe of memory, language, skill, belief, love. Each one of them carrying in their DNA a story that stretched back to the very origin of our species. Because Africa is where humanity was born. Africa is where our genetic diversity is deepest. Africa is the root from which every branch of the human family tree grows. And the African people brought to Brazil did not come from one place. They came from an enormous range of the continent. From the Senegambia region in the northwest. From the Gold Coast, modern Ghana. From the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra. From Central Africa, from the Congo Basin, from Angola. Different peoples, different languages, different genetic profiles, different spiritual traditions, different ways of counting time and understanding the universe. The Yoruba people from what is now Nigeria brought a cosmology so rich, so detailed, so emotionally powerful that it did not die in Brazil. It transformed. It became candomblé, a living religion that today has millions of practitioners and is recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The Bantu-speaking peoples from Central Africa brought musical structures, rhythmic patterns, ways of organizing sound that became the foundation of samba, of funk karaoke, of virtually every musical form that Brazil has given to the world. You cannot hear Brazilian music without hearing Africa, not because it is influence, because it is inheritance. But here is where the story becomes something that no textbook prepared anyone for. Here is where our researcher in Rio de Janeiro found the data point that broke the room. Because when the genetic scientists began mapping the actual proportions of ancestry in the Brazilian population, they expected a certain result, a logical result. Brazil was colonized by Portuguese. Brazil imported millions of Africans. Brazil had a large indigenous population that was mostly destroyed. So the expected genetic map looked something like this: heavy European ancestry among the wealthy and southern populations, heavy African ancestry in the northeast and among darker-skinned Brazilians, small traces of indigenous DNA scattered throughout. Clean, simple, matching the history as it had been written. But the DNA said something completely different. And this is the moment where we need to stop and breathe. Because what the DNA said was not just surprising, it was revolutionary. It was the kind of finding that forces entire scientific fields to sit down quietly in a room and reconsider everything they thought they understood. The researcher in Rio de Janeiro had her data checked 47 times, and every single time, the result came back identical. The genetic ancestry of Brazilians who identified as white, fully European in their self-perception, raised in families that had never once questioned their European heritage. These people were carrying African and indigenous DNA in proportions that nobody had predicted. Not small traces. Not the kind of marginal percentages that could be explained away as statistical noise. Significant proportions. In some cases, people who looked entirely European by any visual standard were carrying genetic ancestry profiles that were 30, 40, sometimes 50% non-European. The blood was telling a story that the mirror had been hiding for generations. And here is where the conflict in that conference room becomes something much larger than a professional disagreement between scientists. Because what this data was doing was not just rewriting the genetic history of Brazil. It was dismantling the entire social architecture that Brazilian society had built on top of a lie. Brazil had constructed its racial identity on the idea of visible categories. You could see who was white, who was black, who was mixed. The census counted people by what they looked like. The social hierarchy rewarded European appearance and punished African and indigenous appearance. And now the genetic evidence was saying that the visible categories and the biological reality had almost nothing to do with each other. That the whitest-looking Brazilian families in the country's most European cities were carrying in their veins the genetic inheritance of enslaved African women, whose names had been erased from every official record, but whose DNA had refused, absolutely refused, to disappear. This is what the man in the back row was really objecting to. Not the methodology, not the statistics. He understood the methodology perfectly well. What he could not accept was the implication. Because if the data was correct, and it was, then the entire social story of Brazil, the comfortable narrative of European civilization building a nation in the tropics, was built on a genetic foundation that told a completely different story. The real builders of Brazil, the women whose bodies were never given a choice in the matter, had left their mark not in the history books, but in the genome of the very people who had tried hardest to forget them. Now let us go deeper. Because the indigenous genetic signature in Brazil carries its own layer of shock that the African story should not overshadow. Remember those first arrivals, the people who walked across the land bridge from Asia 20,000 years ago and eventually found their way to every corner of South America. Their haplogroups are ancient beyond ordinary comprehension. When geneticists talk about haplogroup Q, which is the primary Y chromosome marker of indigenous Americans, they are talking about a lineage that separated from its Asian relatives somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago. When they talk about the mitochondrial haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X that define indigenous American female lineages, they are describing women whose unbroken maternal line stretches back to founding mothers who made the crossing into a new world that no human being had ever seen. And here's the paradox that makes Brazilian genetics so extraordinary. The colonial period killed the indigenous people. The diseases killed them. The wars killed them. The slavery killed them. The displacement killed them. The cultural destruction killed them in ways that did not register in any body count, but were just as complete. By the time the 19th century arrived, the indigenous population of Brazil had collapsed from somewhere between 2 million and 10 million people to a fraction of that number. Official colonial policy for much of the 1900s actively worked to assimilate the remaining indigenous people, to turn them into Brazilians, to make them forget who they were. And yet, the genetic signature of those original 20,000-year-old arrivals is present in the Brazilian genome at levels that the historical record of their destruction would never lead you to expect. How is this possible? How do you nearly destroy a population and still find their DNA running through the veins of millions of people who have no indigenous cultural identity whatsoever? The answer is one of the most important and least discussed facts about Brazilian demographic history. In the early colonial period, before the African slave trade reached its full catastrophic scale, Portuguese men in Brazil needed women. There were almost no Portuguese women in the colony in the first decades of settlement. The colonial enterprise was overwhelmingly male. And so what happened? Sometimes through coercion, sometimes through cultural negotiation, sometimes through what the Portuguese called miscigenação, happened on an enormous scale. Indigenous women became the mothers of the colonial population. Their DNA entered the mainstream of Brazilian genetics through the maternal line, through the mitochondrial inheritance that passes unchanged from mother to child, and it has been there ever since. Invisible to the social categories that Brazil uses to describe itself, but completely visible to the genetic instruments that do not care about skin color or social class, or the stories that families tell themselves at the dinner table. The mitochondrial haplogroup B2, one of the founding female lineages of indigenous Americans, is present in the Brazilian population at frequencies that consistently surprise researchers who are not already familiar with this data. You will find it in families in São Paulo who have been calling themselves Italian for 4 generations. You will find it in families in the south of Brazil who maintain German surnames and celebrate Germanic cultural traditions. The grandmother of a grandmother of a grandmother was a woman who spoke a language that no living person remembers, who knew the name of every plant in a forest that no longer exists, whose people had been here for 15,000 years before a single European ship appeared on the horizon. And her genetic signature is still there, still running, still speaking in the language of nucleotides to anyone willing to listen. This is what geneticists call the genetic echo, the signal that persists long after the source of the sound has gone silent. And Brazil is full of genetic echoes so old and so unexpected that the science of reading them is still catching up to the complexity of what it is finding. Consider the case of the Botocudo people, an indigenous group from the Atlantic Forest region of Minas Gerais and Espírito Santo states, who were among the last indigenous groups in Brazil's coastal region to be contacted by colonial forces, holding out against Portuguese expansion into the interior for longer than almost any other coastal group. When researchers analyzed the DNA of skeletal remains from Botocudo burials, they found something that generated one of the most heated debates in South American archaeology in recent decades. A small but unmistakable genetic signal that appeared to connect the Botocudo to Polynesian populations from the Pacific Ocean, not to Asian populations in general, specifically to Polynesia. The implication was staggering. It suggested a pre-Columbian contact between Polynesian voyagers, the greatest open ocean navigators in human history, and populations in South America. A contact that left a genetic trace in a specific indigenous Brazilian group that has no explanation in the standard model of American population history. The scientific community is still arguing about this finding. Some researchers believe it represents genuine pre-Columbian contact. Others believe it can be explained by other mechanisms, but the data itself is not disputed. The Polynesian signal in the Botocudo genome is real, and it adds yet another layer of complexity to the already incomprehensible genetic depth of Brazil, suggesting that the isolation of the Americas before Columbus may have been less complete than the textbooks assumed, that the Pacific Ocean, which looks on a map like an absolute barrier, was in fact navigated by human beings who left traces of themselves on both shores. And now, with all of these layers established, with the indigenous foundation and the African flood and the European complexity and the Polynesian whisper all present in the genetic record, we can begin to understand what the researcher in Rio de Janeiro was actually looking at when she stood at that podium with tears on her face. She was looking at proof that Brazil is not a nation that was built by Europeans in the tropics. Brazil is a place where the genetic histories of every inhabited continent on Earth were forced into contact by 5 centuries of violence and migration and survival. And what emerged from that contact is something that has no precedent in human history. A population of 215 million people who carry inside them the most complex and layered genetic story on Earth. A population that looks, to the casual observer, like it fits into familiar racial categories, but which, when examined at the level of the genome, dissolves every category and every boundary and every clean narrative into something far more ancient, far more complicated, and far more human than any textbook has ever been willing to say. The scientist who sent the email with the subject line that said we were wrong, the one who was fired the next morning, he was right. Not because the previous research was fraudulent, but because the previous researchers had been asking the wrong questions. They had been trying to confirm what they already believed about Brazil. And the DNA, which has no interest in confirming anybody's beliefs, was patiently, stubbornly, for decades, trying to tell them something different. Something that is still being fully understood. Something whose implications reach far beyond genetics into the heart of what Brazil is, what it has always been, and what it might finally be ready to become. Because here's the thing about genetic truth. It does not wait for permission. It does not ask whether you are ready to hear it. It simply exists, written in the chemistry of every cell of every body, patient as geology, precise as mathematics, and completely indifferent to the stories that human beings tell themselves about who they are and where they come from. The DNA of Brazil has been waiting 500 years for someone to read it honestly. And now that the reading has begun, the story it tells is not a story of conquest. It is not a story of victims. It is not a story that belongs to any single group of people who arrived on this land and decided that their version of events was the only one worth remembering. The story that the DNA of Brazil tells is something far more uncomfortable and far more beautiful than any of those simpler narratives. It is the story of survival itself, of the stubborn, unreasonable, scientifically verifiable fact that human beings, no matter what is done to them, leave something behind that cannot be erased. Not in stone, not in language, not in the names they gave to rivers and mountains, but in blood. Always in blood. Let us talk about something that almost nobody in Brazil's official history wants to discuss directly. The genetic concept that scientists call founder effect. When a small group of people establishes a new population in a new place, their specific genetic characteristics, including rare variants and unusual combinations, become amplified in all the descendants of that founding group. Brazil experienced this process not once, but dozens of times, in dozens of different communities, across 5 centuries of chaotic demographic history. And the results of those founder effects are still visible today in ways that range from medically significant to historically revelatory. In the state of Minas Gerais, researchers from the Federal University identified a community of several thousand people carrying an unusually high frequency of a genetic variant associated with a specific metabolic condition, a variant that in the general Brazilian population appears in roughly 1 person in every 50,000. In this community, it appeared in 1 person in every 40. The investigation traced the origin of this variant to a single woman, an African woman brought to Brazil as a slave in the early 1700s. Whose descendants had remained largely in the same geographic area for nearly 300 years, the founder effect amplifying her specific genetic signature across a community of thousands. Her name was never recorded in any document. No colonial archive contains any reference to her existence. But she is there, undeniably, permanently, in the genome of every person in that community. A woman who was treated as property, leaving a biological mark that outlasted every document that ever tried to define her as less than human. This is what geneticists mean when they talk about the genome as a democratic archive. The official historical record of Brazil is full of the names of Portuguese governors and sugar barons and military commanders and Catholic bishops. The genome of Brazil is full of the names that history forgot. The indigenous women who became the biological mothers of the colonial population. The African women whose children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried their mitochondrial DNA into every corner of Brazilian society. The Jewish converso families who practiced their faith in secret for generations, while their genetic markers quietly persisted in the background of communities that had no awareness of their Sephardic heritage. The genome remembers everyone. It is the most democratic document in human history because it cannot be rewritten by the powerful. It can only be read. And reading it has consequences. Real, present-day consequences that go far beyond academic genetics. Because when Brazilian researchers began publishing the data showing that self-identified white Brazilians carried significant African and indigenous ancestry, it triggered a national conversation about identity, about race, about the affirmative action policies that Brazil had been implementing in its universities and public service to address the inequalities created by centuries of racial hierarchy. If a person who looks white carries 40% African ancestry, what does that mean for a policy designed to benefit Black Brazilians? If the genetic boundary between racial categories in Brazil is as permeable as the data suggests, does that mean that race is not real? And here the scientists had to be very careful, because the answer is complicated in a way that requires precision to avoid being misused. Race as biology, as a fixed genetic category, is not supported by the Brazilian genetic data or by any other genetic data from any human population. The genetic variation within any racial group is far greater than the genetic variation between racial groups. A Black Brazilian and a white Brazilian share more genetic similarities than differences. This is simply true. But race as a social reality, as a system of classification that has been used for 5 centuries to distribute power and resources and life chances, is absolutely real in its consequences, even if it is not real in its biology. The children who grew up in poverty because their skin was too dark for the school that their genetic data shows they had just as much right to attend as anyone else. Their poverty was not imaginary. Their exclusion was not imaginary. The social reality of race in Brazil is as real as the genetic unreality of race in Brazil. And holding both of those truths simultaneously is the only honest way to read what the DNA is actually saying. Now, let us come back to our researcher, the woman who stood at the podium and cried in front of 200 scientists. After the conference ended, after the arguments subsided, after the papers were published and the peer review process ran its slow, grinding course, her data was confirmed. Not just confirmed, but extended. Other researchers, using larger samples, more sophisticated sequencing technology, found the same patterns she had identified and documented them in greater detail. The paper that her institution had tried to suppress was eventually published in one of the most prestigious genetics journals in the world, and received more citations in its first year than any previous study of Brazilian population genetics. The man who had stood up in the back row and called her work impossible wrote a brief letter of acknowledgement that was, by the standards of academic correspondence, approximately as close to an apology as the genre permits. She did not celebrate. She went back to work. Because the confirmation of her findings did not close the question of Brazilian genetics. It opened it wider. Because what her data showed was not just that the ancestry proportions in Brazil were different from what everyone had assumed. It showed that the mixture itself was structured in ways that reflected the specific historical events of the colonial period with extraordinary precision. The genetic data was not just telling you that African and indigenous and European ancestry had mixed. It was telling you when. It was telling you where. It was telling you through which specific population bottlenecks the mixture had passed. The genome of Brazil was not just a record of who was here. It was a timeline of what happened to them. Consider the genetic signature of the sugar economy. The northeast of Brazil, particularly the states of Pernambuco and Bahia, shows the highest proportion of West African Y chromosome haplogroups of any region in the country. This is expected, given the history of the sugar plantation economy and its dependence on enslaved African labor. But the specific distribution of those haplogroups within the region tells a more precise story. The haplogroups associated with Yoruba and Fon populations from the Bight of Benin are concentrated in specific coastal areas corresponding to the periods and ports of highest slave importation from that region. The haplogroups associated with Bantu-speaking Central African populations are more evenly distributed across the interior, reflecting the later period of the slave trade when Central African captives became the dominant source of enslaved labor and were distributed more widely across the agricultural economy. The genetic map of the Northeast is a map of the slave trade drawn in human DNA, precise enough that researchers can trace the shift in the primary African source regions across decades of the colonial period simply by looking at which haplogroups are most common in which municipalities. This level of historical precision in genetic data is something that was not considered possible even 20 years ago. The technology that makes it achievable, the ability to sequence entire genomes at a cost that makes large population studies financially feasible, has only existed for a fraction of the time that geneticists have been asking these questions. And it has transformed the field so completely that many of the foundational assumptions of Brazilian historical demography, assumptions that were built on documentary evidence alone, are now being systematically revised in light of what the genome is saying. The genome is a better historian than the colonial archive in many respects, because the colonial archive was kept by people with an interest in telling a specific story, while the genome was kept by chemistry, which has no interest in anything at all. And this brings us, finally, to the deepest and most important finding of the entire Brazilian genetic story. The finding that our researcher, 6 years into her work, had been building toward without fully realizing it. The finding that explains why her data was so threatening to some people in that conference room and so liberating to others. The finding that connects the specific genetic history of Brazil to something universal about the human species. Geneticists who study human population history have a concept they call deep ancestry. Beyond the last few thousand years of documented history, beyond the migrations and empires and trade routes that appear in the written record, there is an older layer of human movement and mixture that shaped the fundamental genetic architecture of every living human being. And what the Brazilian genetic data shows, when analyzed at sufficient depth, is that the mixture that happened in Brazil over 500 years was in some ways a microcosm of the mixture that has been happening in the human species since its origin. Humans have always mixed. Humans have always migrated. Humans have always encountered other groups of humans and produced children who carried both heritages forward. The idea of pure populations, of unmixed bloodlines, of genetic identity tied to a single place of origin, is not just politically dangerous, It is biologically fictitious. It has never existed anywhere in the human species in any period of human history that genetics can examine. Brazil makes this truth impossible to ignore.